Student government is students' ability to influence their extracurricular reality and education experience through collective decision-making. The extracurricular in this sense is defined as any aspect of the student experience outside of the curriculum, which can include everything from social activities to advocacy and activism. This aligns with the historical evolution of student governments around the world that arose out of a need to collectively decide how to allocate extracurricular resources or change an aspect of the student experience through representation. Defining student government like this allows us to measure the strength of the student voice within the context of power relations in education systems. In other words, it allows us to see limits placed on students' ability to influence their extracurricular realities or have a lasting impact in education politics. Student government is important for multiple reasons. Firstly, students have a vested interest in education decision-making and face systemic power disadvantages in education politics. Quality of education has a substantial impact on a student's future success. So it is important that students can provide feedback on how to ensure it is as effective as possible. Some students even pay large amounts of money for their education, which makes their voice in education systems even more important. Since students often have less experience and have less resources than other education stakeholders, it can be more difficult for them to navigate education politics. Thus, it is very important for students to organize together and pool their resources to improve their political standing to help overcome or at least reduce these disadvantages. Number two, it has the potential for students to make their voice heard in the most effective, equitable, and inclusive way possible. Alternatives to student government often subject students to manipulation by unelected non-student actors or set students up to fail. For example, some student affairs approaches involve a partnerships approach that involves some students being appointed to advise educational leaders on student perspectives. This is problematic because it exudes tokenism, patronage, and corruption. In other words, educational leaders can appoint students who agree with them and who are loyal to them. The partnerships approach is also inherently ageist because it implies that students are too stupid to represent themselves and need non-student stakeholders to facilitate it for them. Another alternative to student government is simply relying on the more organic and informal student movements, which can have some potential to enact change, but on their own, they do not guarantee inclusive participation and equitable collective decision-making structure, and often consist of small percentages of the student populations that are often led by small groups of elite students. Moreover, student movements that are not supported by student governments place students on the outside of education politics. So students have to expend much more effort and expose themselves to much more risk, sometimes even injury and death, than other education stakeholders who may be able to enact the same change by passing a motion in a boardroom. This is not to say that student governments cannot be flawed, and indeed, much focus needs to be placed on improving student governments so they do not become too populist or authoritarian, but to critique student democracy wholesale is to critique democracy itself. And number three, student government is often a citizen's first experience with collective decision-making in which they have full political rights. For example, in contemporary democracies, a student government is often a citizen's first experience in which they can vote, run for office, and fully participate in the political system, while other levels of government have minimum ages for political participation. It is therefore very important to ensure that citizens' first political experience is the best it can be, because it has the potential to shape their views toward politics for the rest of their life. For example, if students' first impression with their student government is that it is a popularity contest where a small clique controls everything and that it is not a worthwhile mechanism to make their voices heard, it may lead them to disengage from politics entirely and view all politics to be similar. Some scholars view student government as representing students as an interest group or a stakeholder in education. Others view students as consumers and approach student government as a mechanism for customer feedback. Still others view students as laborers and view student government as a labor union. I would challenge all of these conceptualizations by saying that they are too narrow. In contemporary societies, being a student is necessary to function. Thus, student government, or at least the potential for it, is inevitable. In cases where a formal student government does not exist, I would view this as anarchy or rule by non-student stakeholders. In fact, the complexity and totality of the student experience can be likened to a microcosmic society, a distinct student culture and subcultures that exist within our own. So instead of viewing students merely as an interest group, as consumers, or as laborers, I view them as political citizens because this allows us to view student government holistically in the context of student culture in a way that legitimizes students' lived experiences while helping us understand the inherent discriminatory barriers that students face in education decision-making. Student politics is real politics, and to students, it matters. Thank you.